Hey everyone, today I'm back in Lost Ark to talk about Artist, the latest addition to the support role, and the class that has very quickly made its way to being my favorite support in the game. The aesthetic is one such reason. I just like the animations and the theme of the class. She's a painter with a giant brush that she uses to whack enemies, but she can also paint animals to life and then she uses those to attack with. The gameplay itself also feels really smooth, but I guess that goes for most swiftness-based classes, and well, she's also kinda cute. Now, if I had to use one word as to why I like Artist the most over the other supports, then it would be flexibility. This isn't just talking about all the different utility skills that you can switch in as you need them, but mostly talking about the identity gauge. When we look at Paladin and Bard, their identity gauge is very rigid. With Paladin, you need to fill the whole gauge before you can activate it, and then in turn it will provide you with a damage buff and a health regeneration buff. Bard has to choose. Either they use their gauge for damage or they use it for healing, and regardless of what they choose, their whole gauge will be used. Ideally you want to use 1 bar for healing and 3 bar for damage, but sometimes you will run into a scenario where you really need to help out your party with a heal, and if you already have 2 or maybe even 3 bars at a time, then it just really sucks having to sacrifice your strong damage buff for that and start all the way back from 0. Artist doesn't really have this problem. Her gauge looks very similar to Bard, with her being able to fill up 3 bubbles, however both the damage and the heal have a fixed cost to use. If you want to use a heal, it will cost you 1 bubble. If you want to use your damage buff, that will cost you 2 bubbles. No more, no less. So while you're still slowing down the time it takes for you to use that damage buff if you end up healing, it won't set you back all the way to the starting point like it does for Bard. Another thing is that Artist has a lot of skills that have gauge generation tripods on them, so she can fill her gauge really quickly. Her awakening will also grant her 2 bubbles when you use it. So as you can see, it's really easy to build gauge on her, and then using either the heal or the damage buff doesn't immediately lock you out from using the other one right after, granted you have enough bubbles for it of course. So to me it just kind of feels like Bard, but better. The downside though is that her healing and damage buffing is then a tiny bit weaker compared to Bard and Paladin. Only makes sense because she has such a high uptime on the damage buff and she can heal more frequently. The difference is that her damage buff will only boost the damage by 10% and last for 10 seconds. Paladin's is also 10%, but it will last for about 16 seconds, so a little bit longer, and for Bard, even a 2 bar damage buff is going to be slightly stronger, because that's 10% for 12 seconds, so 2 seconds longer, and a 3 bar is both stronger in potency and lasts even longer, going all the way to 16 seconds like Paladin. But I do think it's a worthwhile trade-off, because it makes it much easier to choose if you want to use your damage buff or your healing, and even if you do decide to use the other one, it's really easy to get your gauge back within a few skills, so you can still use that heal right after or try to catch the end of the burst of one of your DPSs. In terms of healing, same story really. Artist's heal is primarily a single target heal. The AoE aspect comes from your full bloom class engraving, and it can't really compare to Bard's desperate salvation heal. However, how often do you run into a situation where you need to heal the full team for a lot of damage? Usually players will get hit by some chip damage here or there, which the AoE aspect of your heal will usually be able to take care of that. And then if someone was to get hit by something that they really shouldn't have gotten hit by, then they can interact with the orb that you place on the floor for that powerful single target heal. And I kind of prefer this more, to be honest. Paladin doesn't really have much agency over when they want to heal. I know their shield technically heals when it expires, but their stronger heal comes from using Blessed Aura, and you need full gauge for this. With Bard, it also feels really bad having to use your strong AoE heal just to heal one party member, because it kind of feels like it goes to waste, and again, it could set back your damage buff by quite a bit depending on how many bars you had ready when you used it. With Artist, it doesn't feel that bad. Another cool thing is that these orbs you create stay on the field for a little while, so when you need to use your heal just to heal up some chip damage for example, then you still have that orb sitting around in case someone was to get hit in the near future. This is also something that you can play into on fights that have frequent damage reduction. Good examples for that would be Belshazzar Gate 4, where the boss frequently has periods of damage reduction, or Kakul Seidon Gate 3, where you pushed him fast enough to go to showtime, but you still have a Mario to do. During those times, it's not worth using your gauge to buff damage because there's so much damage reduction on the boss. So you can just throw around with our essentially free heals. And depending on how long this damage reduction lasts, you can use more or less of these heals. Just try to make sure that you have a full gauge ready by the time the boss takes full damage again. But during this damage reduction time, you can heal up your team with the AoE heals, and if they don't interact with your orbs, then you'll still have some lying around for afterwards, if they haven't expired by then, of course, because they don't stay around forever. So as you can see, I'm quite a fan of how Artist Identity Gauge functions. But how does the rest of the class function? Well, just like the other two supports, you have a brand or a marking that you want to keep up at all times, 2 damage skills and some damage reduction skills. When you look at the core kit, I feel like there are 5 skills that are mandatory. The branding skill, 2 damage buff skills, 2 shielding skills. The other 3 spots you can fill up with what you feel like is needed for a certain encounter, or if you don't need anything special, just more gauge generation skills. You can never go wrong with that. In the early game, where you don't have a high swiftness stat or a high cooldown reduction gem on your main branding skill, it's probably also worth taking a second branding skill to ensure that you have 100% uptime on that. But if you don't need that, then there are a lot of other options. While Artist does have its own version of Godsend Law and Rhapsody of Light from Paladin and Bard, it's not that great of a skill because it's an AoE that surrounds the artist, so you need to do a get down Mr. President by jumping at a DPS that is about to get hit and then use this skill. So it's not that user friendly because Bard and Paladin can use this skill from afar, so it's not that great. It's also the reason why I almost never run this skill and look at what might be useful in the fight instead. Do I need a cleanse? Do I need extra weak point? Maybe an extra strong stagger skill could be useful, or maybe I want to take a second counter skill. Those are all viable options that you can consider depending on the encounter that you're doing. And again, if you don't need anything special, just run more gauge generation skills to pump out more heals and more damage buffs. In terms of engravings, there's also a few choices that you can make, but I decided to keep it very similar to Bard. Full Bloom class engraving for that AoE healing, Expert Awakening and Heavy Armor. The 4 staples on Bard, which are just as good on Artist. And then for the 5th engraving, I decided to go with Vital Point Hit to boost my stagger damage quite a bit. Drops of Ether is the other option, but I feel like lately VPH is just more valuable in most of the fights than drops, so that is why I went with that. Now, something that you can do with the release of Ancient Accessories is cut down on 1 level of Heavy Armor and slot in level 2 Spirit Absorption to cap out your attack speed. I personally haven't really felt the need for this, but if you feel like certain skills are a bit too slow for you, then this is another option. You will be a little bit more squishy, but you won't be stuck in animations as much, which might prevent you from getting hit in the first place. The main reason why people do this is because of the long animation on Hopper. This is your main shielding skill and gauge generation skill. You could run a Galewind rune on this to speed up the skill animation, but I prefer running a Wealth rune myself because, as I said, it is one of your main gauge skills. So play around with it and decide for yourself is probably the best advice I could give you there. I guess one last thing I should touch on is her solo play. The 2nd class engraving provides her with crit rate and crit damage after using either a heal or a damage buff from your identity gauge. And as I mentioned before, you generate gauge really quickly, so you'll be able to spam out either a second heal or a second damage buff even before this buff times out. This pairs together with some tripods that give you benefits when you're alone in a party, make solo content fairly smooth for her. Her Chaos Dungeons are just about as fast as they are on any of my other classes, but of course she is still a support, so if you want to play DPS Artist, then you won't really be able to complete with your normal DPS classes, given everyone is of the same skill level of course. But for solo play, it's certainly worth using. When you're doing your Chaos Dungeons or when you're doing story, just double equip the class engraving and you're good to go. So that's Artist in Lost Ark. A very fun class to play, equipped with all the tools to handle any scenario the game might throw at you, and a class that will stay part of my main roster for a very long time going forward. And with that, I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.